In this video I'm going to be covering a way of injecting resin into a silicon mould. This is something that I included in a recent build video and a few people have commented on it, so I thought it would be useful to sort of break out this footage into a separate video because I think it's quite an interesting technique and one that I found myself using quite frequently now. What I've found from previous projects is it can sometimes be quite difficult to get some resin into moulds for very small items, and while I was able to pour some resin into the mould, the resin wouldn't always make its way through the air channel that I'd included, and so that was a problem because you would often end up with air bubbles in your casts which you would then have to fill in, so it created quite a lot of work. I also had some problems casting up some pressure vessels as well, and because they were quite small, again the resin wouldn't flow through the mould, so I needed to find a way of pushing that resin through. The reason I started looking into this is because I needed to cast up some small items for a robot project that I was building. So what I've done is to cut up some pieces of acrylic and styrene tube to make a finger. And the idea of this is I'm going to make moulds of all of these pieces so I can reproduce multiple fingers. So I'm just going to blue tack these together so you can sort of see what this is going to look like. So there you go, so as you can see it's a fairly complicated piece, so I needed to start thinking about how exactly I was going to mould this. If you've seen some of my previous videos, you'll know about pressure casting. So what you do is you pour your resin into your mould, put it in a pressure pot, increase the pressure, and what that does is it crunches all of the bubbles down to tiny dots so that you don't get any air bubbles in your casts. Now I could have done this for this, to be honest with you I was probably being a little bit lazy. For something so small it's a bit of a faff to sort of get the pressure chamber out, pressurise the compressor, all of that stuff, so I wanted something I could just do very quickly on the desktop. So what I've done is make a sprue, so I've got channels to allow the resin in and the air out, as you can see, and what I've got is this large canister on the side. Now what I've basically done here is to make an injection mould. So to demonstrate how this is going to work, I'm going to pour some resin into the cavity where that large bar is. I'm then going to push the bar into the mould like this. What that's going to do is force the resin through the mould and back up out of the air channels. So I've just got the piece inside some foam board there. I was pouring some silicone rubber over it. So that's now dry, so I can now cut open the mould and free the pieces. This is quite a slow process, there's quite a lot of detail in this, so it took quite a while to cut this free, but got there in the end. Right, so I've mixed up some resin, so here we go, I'm going to pour that into the cavity. And then pressing down with the plunger forces the resin through the mould. Well, so there we go, so there's a cast from the mould. I have to say I'm really surprised at how well this has come out. There are a few air bubbles around some of the edges, but generally speaking it's come out really well, so that bodes well. So what I can now do is go ahead and produce 10 fingers, and that makes things fairly easy. Obviously hands are always a bit tricky because there's so many individual pieces to them, so I do tend to dread doing them, but this has made things quite easy, so I'm really pleased with that. Right, so there's the pieces all glued together, and that's one finger. And here's the beginning of a hand. I've just blue tacked the pieces together to give you a basic idea of how that will look. I've also gone on to make another similar mould for the pressure canister that I mentioned earlier. The problem with this one again is because it's such a small piece and the channels that I've created in the mould are quite thin. Gravity alone isn't enough to cause the resin to flow through the mould, so the plunger here just adds a bit of pressure to that to allow that to flow through. What I've found is that because you're using a bit of pressure to actually cause the resin to flow through the mould, that has the effect of pushing air out of the mould as the resin flows through. So although there are some small air bubbles in some of these casts, generally speaking I've found the quality of the cast to be pretty good. And that's now set and that's looking pretty good. So I can see myself using this technique quite a lot for smaller pieces, and maybe even for some larger items depending on the complexity of the shape. So anyway, just a quick video on this. I think it's quite an interesting technique, so hopefully it will be useful in your projects as well. But for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.